On a strip of paper moving slowly through a machine, a line traces the electrical life of a sleeping brain. For most of the night, that line rolls in wide, lazy arcs, slow, soft hills of voltage rising and falling in long, unhurried sweeps. Then something changes. The hills flatten. The line begins to quiver in tight, rapid tremors, small and fast and close together, indistinguishable at a glance from the jagged, quick activity of a brain fully awake and attending to the world. The body it belongs to has not moved. The room is dark and still. Every voluntary muscle is silent. And yet, to the instrument recording it, the brain inside that skull appears to have woken up. It has not woken. It has gone somewhere else entirely. This is the edge of REM sleep. The moment the sleeping brain shifts from one mode of darkness into another, the shift is not gradual. On the paper trace, it arrives cleanly, a demarcation between two different electrical languages, the slow oscillations of deep sleep giving way to something low amplitude and fast and wild with activity. The body stays perfectly still. The brain, by every electrical measure, is running. That transition, that small, precise change in the shape of a line, is the beginning of dreaming. The night is not a single thing. From the outside, sleep looks like a long and featureless absence, the body horizontal, the breath steady, the person simply gone for a while. From the inside of the recording, it is a structured architecture, a sequence of stages cycling through the hours in a pattern as predictable as tides. The first cycle begins with the slow descent through lighter and then deeper non-REM sleep, the brain gradually quieting, the metabolic rate falling, the muscles releasing their tension one group at a time. About an hour and a half into sleep, the first turn comes. The descent reverses. The brain's electrical activity shifts upward toward the fast, desynchronized pattern of waking, and the first period of REM sleep begins. That first REM period is short. It lasts perhaps 10 minutes, sometimes less. Then the cycle begins again, the descent, the quiet, the return. Each time the cycle completes and REM sleep reappears, it is longer than the one before. By the final hours of a full night's sleep, the REM period stretched to 30 or 40 minutes, and the dreaming brain holds its strange activity for long, sustained intervals before the morning comes. This is why dreams remembered upon waking tend to feel long and elaborate. They most often come from those final, extended REM episodes, when the brain has had the most time to build its inner world. The machine that records all of this is called a polysomnograph. It does not interpret, it simply measures, and what it measures in the EEG trace, the electroencephalogram, the electrical record of the brain's surface, is the collective behavior of millions of neurons firing and resting beneath the skull. During deep non-REM sleep, those millions of neurons tend to synchronize, rising and falling together in slow, coordinated waves. During REM sleep, they lose that coordination entirely. Each fires on its own schedule, at its own moment, producing the low amplitude, high frequency activity that looks on the trace so much like waking. Sleep researchers call this desynchronized activity, the brain uncoupled from its own collective rhythm, each neuron contributing its small electrical voice to a vast, quiet chorus of individual noise. Behind the forehead of the sleeping person, behind the closed eyelids, the eyes move. They move in rapid, conjugate bursts, both eyes together side to side, or at angles in small precise jerks that last only fractions of a second before stilling, then beginning again. The muscles that move them are among the few voluntary muscles in the body not fully silenced during REM sleep. Every other skeletal muscle, the arms, the legs, the trunk, the neck has been rendered almost entirely inert by a mechanism that runs down through the brainstem and out through the spinal cord, actively suppressing their ability to act. But the eyes move. They move as if watching something, tracking something, following a scene that has no physical existence anywhere in the room. This is where the name comes from: rapid eye movement sleep, discovered and named in 1953 when Nathaniel Kleitman and his graduate student Eugene Oserinsky first noticed the movements on the polysomnographic record and realized they corresponded when sleepers were woken from them with vivid reports of dreaming. The eyes move, the body stays still, the brain is as active as it is awake. These three facts together make REM sleep one of the most distinctive biological states known, a state of profound physical immobility paired with an inner life of extraordinary vividness. To understand how that inner life is produced, it is necessary to go down from the convoluted surface of the cerebral cortex, with its language and memory and careful planning, down through the structures deeper in the skull, down to the brainstem, the oldest part of the brain, the part that handles breathing and heart rate and the most basic rhythms of staying alive. It is here, in a cluster of nuclei in the region called the pons, that REM sleep begins. The neurons that initiate REM are cholinergic. They communicate using a chemical called acetylcholine. They sit in two small groups within the pontine brainstem, the laterodorsal tegmentum and the pedunculopontine tegmentum. These are dense, compact clusters of cells, small in the scheme of the whole brain, but their reach is long. When they become active, they release acetylcholine in ascending currents that spread upward through the brain, reaching the thalamus, the limbic system, and ultimately the broad surface of the cerebral cortex. That ascending chemical tide is the trigger. It is what switches the cortex from its slow, synchronized deep sleep rhythms into the fast, desynchronized activity of the EEG's waking-like trace. The cells of the lateral dorsal and pedunculopontine tegmentum turn on, and above them the cortex comes alive, not to the world, but to itself. One of the first things that activation produces is a wave. It begins in the pons, in those same cholinergic cells, as a brief and sharp electrical discharge, a burst of activity that lasts only milliseconds. From the pons, this burst travels upward along a specific anatomical pathway, passing through a structure in the thalamus called the lateral geniculate nucleus, which under ordinary waking conditions serves as the brain's primary relay station for visual information from the eyes. The wave passes through this relay as if the relay were receiving a real signal from the outside world. Then it continues upward, reaching the occipital cortex at the back of the skull, the brain's visual processing center, the region where sight happens. The occipital cortex receives the wave. It responds. It does not know the wave came from inside. These waves were first documented in cats, where electrode recordings from the pons, the lateral geniculate nucleus, and the occipital cortex revealed the sharp, synchronized discharges traveling along this pathway during REM sleep. The researcher who studied them most carefully and who gave them their name was Alan Hobson, working in the 1970s. He called them pontogeniculo-occipital waves, PGO waves, and he proposed that they function as a kind of internally generated sensory input. The visual cortex, receiving bursts of electrical activity via the same pathway through which it normally receives signals from the eyes, interprets those bursts the way it would interpret any visual input, as something to be seen. It assembles them, it processes them, it begins to generate the experience of vision, not from light entering the eyes, but from a wave that began in the dark interior of the brainstem and traveled upward like a stone's ripple, reaching the far edge of a still pond. This is one of the first physical mechanisms of dreaming, the visual cortex, activating not in response to the world, but in response to its own deep structures, sending signals upward into it. The picture that the visual cortex begins to build from those PGO wave signals is not random, or at least not fully random. It draws on what is already stored, on memory, on prior perceptual experience, on the brain's accumulated library of what things look like and how they move and what their edges are. But the raw material driving the construction comes from below, from the brainstem, arriving in bursts and salvos that carry no inherent narrative, no content in themselves. What the cortex does with them is what produces the imagery. The dream scenery emerges from the collision between an ancient, internally generated electrical signal and the brain's vast learned archive of how the world appears. The brainstem does not only send signals up, it also, during REM sleep, does something else, something that shapes the entire neurochemical environment in which those signals are received. Two systems that are active and influential during waking go quiet, almost completely quiet. The first is centered in a small, densely pigmented cluster of cells in the upper brainstem called the locus coeruleus. These cells produce norepinephrine, a chemical that, when released across the brain, tends to sharpen attention, increase critical appraisal, and orient thinking toward the external world. During waking, the locus coeruleus maintains a steady background output of norepinephrine that contributes to a kind of chemical alertness running through the brain's activity at all times. The norepinergic tone, researchers call it the quiet, steady hum of a system that keeps the waking brain calibrated to reality. During REM sleep, the locus coeruleus falls silent. Its cells stop firing. The norepinephrine goes away. The second system, nearby, follows the same course. The dorsal raphe nucleus, a cluster of cells that produces serotonin, a chemical associated with mood regulation and the modulation of sensory thresholds, also falls nearly silent during REM sleep. The serotonergic signal, like the norepinergic one, withdraws. What remains is the cholinergic system, ascending from those pontine clusters, filling the space the other two have vacated. Sleep researchers describe this as an aminergic off, cholinergic on state. The two amin-based systems silenced, the acetylcholine system dominant. And the consequences of that particular neurochemical configuration are significant. Without the steadying influence of norepinephrine, the brain's capacity for critical self-reflection is reduced. The checks that normally apply to perception, the moment of doubt, the recognition that something is improbable, the comparison of incoming experience against the known rules of the physical world, those checks are not operating at full capacity. Meanwhile, the cholinergic activity is amplifying the vividness of the perceptual experience being generated, making the internally produced imagery feel not only present, but real. This is why dreams are believed. In the dreaming brain, a person can find themselves in a room that keeps changing shape, speaking to a figure that shifts identities mid-sentence, traveling through a landscape that defies geography, and accept all of it without question, without the suspicion that something is wrong. The critical faculty that would in waking immediately flag these events as impossible is running on reduced chemical power. The amine systems that calibrate reality judgment have gone offline for the night. What remains is a brain of wide open, uncritical, vivid experience, receptive to everything its own activity generates, unable to step back from the stream of images and evaluate them from the outside. While those changes are occurring in the brainstem and the systems it modulates, something is also happening far above, in the broad, wrinkled surface of the cerebral cortex, in the network of regions that becomes most active during dreaming, spread across the inner surface of the cerebral hemispheres in regions that curve around the brain's midline, and along its back lies a distributed network of cortical areas that are most active not during focused, task-directed thought, but during moments of internal reflection, self-referential thinking, and the free associative wandering of an undirected mind. This network includes areas in the medial prefrontal cortex, just behind the forehead, which are involved in self-referential processing, thinking about oneself, about one's own mental states, about the social world, and one's place in it. It includes the posterior cingulate cortex, a region near the back of the brain's inner surface, which serves as a kind of hub for the integration of memory and spatial orientation, and it includes the angular gyrus, a region at the meeting point of the temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes, where sensory processing from multiple modalities, sight, sound, touch, body position, comes together with language and memory in a single integrative zone. Imaging studies using fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, which tracks blood flow as a proxy for neural activity, have revealed that this network, called the default mode network, shows high and coordinated activity during REM sleep. The pattern of its activation during dreaming overlaps substantially with the pattern seen during waking states of mind wandering and autobiographical memory retrieval. Those moments when the mind turns inward, drifts through past events, rehearses possible futures, or loses itself in the flow of its own associations. The default mode network appears to be the cortical architecture of the self-referential inner life, and during dreaming it runs. The angular gyrus deserves a moment of particular attention. It sits at the intersection of the brain's sensory, emotional, and memory processing streams, and during REM sleep it receives converging inputs from all of them at once. Visual signals arrive from the occipital processing regions. Emotional signals arrive from the limbic system, the amygdala, and surrounding structures, which are also known to be highly active during REM sleep, producing the intense, sometimes overwhelming emotional quality that characterizes many dreams. Memory signals arrive from the hippocampal system, which is replaying and distributing stored experiences through the cortex while the body sleeps. The angular gyrus receives all of this simultaneously: sights, feelings, memories, arriving in overlapping waves. And it does what it always does. It tries to assemble them into something coherent, into a place, into a situation, into something that feels, while it is happening, like the world. The emotional intensity of the dreaming state comes in large part from the amygdala, a structure deep in the temporal lobe that functions as the brain's primary evaluator of emotional significance, particularly negative significance, particularly anything that might be threatening, frightening, or urgent. During REM sleep, the amygdala is among the most active structures in the entire brain. Its heightened activity during dreaming contributes the sense of fear, of longing, of inexplicable sadness or joy that often saturates dream experience without apparent cause. The emotional color of the dream does not always follow the narrative. The feeling comes first, or comes in excess of what the dream's events would seem to call for, because the amygdala is generating it independently, and the dreaming cortex then builds a narrative around the emotion rather than the emotion arising naturally from events. The prefrontal cortex during REM sleep shows a more complex picture. Some of its regions are active, others are relatively suppressed compared to their waking state. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the region most associated with deliberate, logical, step-by-step reasoning, with working memory and executive control, tends toward lower activity during REM sleep than during waking. This reduced prefrontal governance contributes, alongside the withdrawn aminergic tone, to the loosened associative logic of dream thinking. Events and dreams do not need to follow from one another. Causality can be absent. Contradictions can coexist. The part of the brain most responsible for insisting on logical coherence is, like the locus ceruleus, running at something below full capacity. What the default mode network builds in this neurochemical and structural landscape: high amygdala activity, withdrawn prefrontal governance, no aminergic critical monitoring, the cortex flooded with internally generated PGO wave signals interpreted as visual input, is a world, not a world like the waking world, not a world that follows rules consistently or maintains its geography reliably, but a world that is, for the duration of the dream, inhabited and experienced as real. A world with characters in it, with emotional weight, with spaces that feel navigable and events that feel consequential. The brain generates this world from the inside. No external input is required. No information from the eyes, none from the ears, nothing from the skin or the balance organs in the inner ear. The sensory gating that ordinarily connects the cortex to the outside world has been largely closed. The thalamus, which normally relays sensory information from the periphery to the cortex, suppresses that relay during REM sleep, protecting the sleeping brain from casual external interruption. What passes through is the brainstem's own ascending signal, the PGO waves, the cholinergic activation, the internal tide, and what the cortex does with it is entirely its own. There is something both ordinary and remarkable about this. Every night, in every sleeping human, a brain that evolved to model the external world turns its modeling apparatus inward and runs it without any external world to model. It simulates, not deliberately, not with awareness or intention, but because the machinery that produces the simulation, the brainstem activation, the ascending waves, the cholinergic tide, the responsive cortex, simply runs, because the circuits that generate dreaming are the same circuits that generate waking experience, now turned loose from the anchoring constraint of actual sensory input and left to fire as their internal rhythms direct. The muscle atonia that accompanies all of this is worth holding in attention for a moment. The body's stillness during REM sleep is not the passive stillness of exhaustion or of muscles simply resting. It is active suppression. Neurons in the brainstem send inhibitory signals downward through the spinal cord, actively preventing motor neurons from transmitting commands to the skeletal muscles. The brain, during dreaming, may generate commands, the neural correlates of running, of reaching, of speaking, but those commands are blocked before they can reach the muscles. The body does not act out its dreams, the inhibitory mechanism holds. Only the eye muscles and the muscles involved in breathing and heartbeat are exempt from this paralysis. Everything else waits, pinned in stillness, while the brain travels. This mechanism is why, in the rare cases where it breaks down, a condition that does occur, in which the motor inhibition during REM sleep partially fails, sleepers begin to move, to gesture, to enact the physical content of their dreams. They have been observed, reaching, walking, speaking, sometimes crying out. The eyes still show the rapid conjugate movements of REM. The EEG still shows the fast, desynchronized waking-like pattern. Only the silence of the body has been lost. These cases, when they were first carefully studied, became part of the evidence that the brain, during REM sleep, is genuinely generating motor programs, genuinely producing the neural equivalent of physical action, that the dreaming of running is not merely an image of running, but involves, somewhere in the motor system, something that resembles a real attempt to run, quietly suppressed before it reaches the muscles. behind closed eyelids in the dark, in rooms across the world, in bodies lying completely still. This machinery runs every night. It has been running for a long time. REM sleep has been documented not only in humans, but across a broad range of mammalian species, and in birds, and in some form in reptiles, though the debate over its presence and nature in non-mammalian species is ongoing. In mammals, the basic architecture is remarkably consistent. The cholinergic brainstem nuclei, the aminergic withdrawal, the ascending activation, the motor atonia, the rapid eye movements. In platypuses, in opossums, in cats whose brains first revealed the pontogeniculo-occipital waves that helped explain how visual dreaming might be generated. The same cycle, the same electrical architecture, cycling through every night's sleep as regularly as the tides. Whatever this state is for, whatever function it serves or does not serve, it is old. It persisted through an enormous stretch of evolutionary time. It survived every period of pressure and change that shaped the lineages carrying it. It runs tonight, in the sleeping body lying in the dark, as it ran in bodies long before this one existed. The first question is not why. The first question is what. What is actually happening? What machinery is turning? What structures are involved? And that question has a detailed and specific answer, built from decades of careful recording, from electrodes placed in sleeping cats and sleeping humans, from MRI machines imaging the active brain at rest, from the slow accumulation of a picture that was not available 50 years ago, and that is still, in some of its finer details, being worked out. What is happening is this. A cluster of cells in the lower brainstem activates. It releases acetylcholine in ascending waves. Those waves reach a relay station in the thalamus and are passed upward to the visual cortex, which receives them as if they were signals from the eyes and begins to process them as visual experience. At the same time, two other neurochemical systems, the noradrenergic and the serotonergic, fall silent, withdrawing the chemical background that supports critical appraisal and reality monitoring. The motor system is inhibited, so the body stays still. The eyes move. The amygdala activates, flooding the processing cortex with emotional signal, and across the inner surfaces of the brain, the default mode network, the network most associated with self-referential thought, with autobiographical memory, with the narrative construction of a sense of self situated in a world, comes alive, drawing together all of these inputs into something unified. The angular gyrus receives the converging signals. Memory arrives from the hippocampal system, replaying fragments of stored experience. Visual imagery arrives from the occipital regions, generated from the brainstem's ascending waves. Emotional color arrives from the amygdala, deep and present and not always explicable. Spatial and bodily orientation arrives from the parietal regions nearby. Language and conceptual structure arrive from the temporal regions. And from all of these arriving streams, under the reduced governance of the prefrontal lobes, and in the absence of the amine systems that would normally insist on coherence and plausibility, the angular gyrus and its network partners build a place, a scene, a situation with weight and texture and the feeling of being real. This is the brain's inner world, not a metaphor, not a figure of speech, a specific, traceable, biologically generated landscape produced by identifiable machinery in the sleeping brain, cycling through every night, becoming longer and more elaborate as the hours of sleep accumulate toward morning. The instruments that revealed it were not dramatic. An EEG machine, recording electrical fluctuations at the scalp through small metal electrodes affixed with conductive gel, the whole apparatus looking more like a cap of wires than anything that might be expected to illuminate the nature of dreams. A polysomnograph capturing not only the EEG, but the eye movements, the muscle tone, the respiratory rate, the heart's rhythm, all of it printed onto a moving paper trace or stored in a digital record, a night of sleep rendered as a long ribbon of changing signals. The fMRI scanner, large and loud and expensive, producing images of blood flow across the brain's surface and interior in the sleeping volunteers who agreed to sleep inside it while being imaged. From these instruments, quietly, came the picture, not all at once, over decades. With each new piece of evidence, the picture gained detail. First, the basic fact of REM sleep and its association with dreaming, then the brainstem nuclei responsible for generating it, then the PGO waves and their trajectory, then the neurochemical profile of the aminergic withdrawal, then the imaging of the default mode network active during sleep. The picture was built the way most scientific pictures are built, slowly, by many people, with frequent revision and occasional surprise. The whole enterprise, far less dramatic than a summary of it, tends to suggest. What it shows is a brain that, when the external world is closed away for the night, turns its generating capacity inward. The same circuits that during waking build a model of the outside world, receiving sensory signals, integrating them across modalities, situating the self within a coherent spatial and social landscape, adding emotional weight to the things that matter. Those circuits continue their work. They cannot stop. They are what the brain does. Without external input to structure them, they structure themselves, drawing on the ascending signals from the brainstem, the stored residue of waking experience held in memory, the emotional evaluations already made and cataloged in the amygdala, the narrative-making tendencies of the default mode network, and they produce from all of it a world that needs no outside. The sleeping brain does not rest in any simple sense. The cortex does not go dark. The circuits do not wait in silence for morning. Something is happening, something with electrical coherence and chemical specificity and anatomical precision, something that has been happening every night in every human who has ever slept, something ancient and persistent and in its basic outlines now understood. Out beyond the last paragraph, past the machinery of acetylcholine and the silence of the locus coeruleus, past the rapid conjugate movements of two eyes that see nothing in the dark room, but everything in the world, the brain is building. The default mode network draws together its converging streams, memory, sensation, self, the unnamed emotional weight arriving from deep in the limbic system, and assembles them into something that, for the duration of sleep, is the only world there is. The angular gyrus integrates. The medial prefrontal cortex situates the dreamer within the scene. The posterior cingulate anchors the experience in space that feels navigable, in time that feels continuous, and in the still dark body on the bed, with every voluntary muscle silent, with the eyes moving in their small, precise arcs, with the EEG trace running its low and vivid and waking-like line, the entire inner landscape holds, real and inhabited and complete for as long as the sleep continues. In the collected records of thousands of dreamers across dozens of independent studies, one pattern appears so consistently that researchers began to describe it not as an observation, but as a law. Threatening events, pursuit, confrontation, physical danger, the closing of escape routes, appear in dream reports at a rate far exceeding anything their actual frequency in waking life would predict. A person living in a safe home, in a peaceful city, in a country at rest, will nonetheless dream of being chased, of being cornered, of a door that will not open in time. The numbers, when researchers began to count them carefully, did not lie and did not waver. Something in the sleeping mind was leaning steadily and reliably toward the dangerous. The database that made this visible was assembled slowly over many decades by researchers who asked ordinary people to record their dreams in the minutes after waking and then subjected those reports to systematic, category by category analysis. The coding system they used sorted dream content into bins, settings, characters, objects, social interactions, emotions, and what the researchers called misfortunes, events in which the dreamer experienced harm, threat, or loss. When the misfortune tallies came in, across culture after culture, decade after decade, the proportion of dreams containing threatening events was not what a random sample of a person's life would produce. Danger was overrepresented, not slightly, not in a way that could be explained by the drama of memory or the distortions of recall. The lean was systematic and deep. A Finnish cognitive neuroscientist named Antti Revonsuo looked at that pattern in the late 1990s and asked what it would mean if it were not an accident. If the distribution of threat in dreams were not a statistical artifact, not a quirk of how frightening things lodge in memory more firmly than peaceful ones, but instead the precise output of a system doing exactly what it was shaped to do. What kind of system would that be, and what would it be for? The answer he proposed, published in the year 2000 in a journal called Behavioral and Brain Sciences, was called the threat simulation theory. It was not a small claim. It proposed that dreaming, or at least a substantial and ancient core of what dreaming does, exists to run simulated threat scenarios in the offline safety of sleep, to rehearse the detection of danger, the reading of pursuit, the calculation of escape, so that when those scenarios arise in waking life, the responding mind is not encountering them for the first time. The argument rested on a specific understanding of where human beings came from and what the long stretch of their ancestral past actually looked like. The environment in which the human nervous system took its present shape was not an office or a quiet street. It was a landscape in which large predators were real and present, in which rival groups of other humans posed genuine lethal threat, in which a misjudged distance or a failed escape could end a life and end it young. Revonsuo drew on the evolutionary framework that describes this original context as the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, the conditions under which natural selection was operating most powerfully on the human lineage during the Pleistocene, the long glacial epoch that ended only about 12,000 years ago. By the time of the Pleistocene's close, the human brain had been shaped by millions of years of exactly that world. In that world, the ability to detect a predator early mattered. The ability to read the posture of a threatening stranger mattered. The ability to find the gap in a closing circle of danger, to know, without having to reason through it slowly, which direction offered escape, mattered in a way that was not abstract. It was the kind of mattering that determined whether a given individual passed their traits forward into the next generation. And Revonsuo's proposal was that the sleeping brain, night after night, was running a training program designed precisely for that kind of mattering. The logic of the theory follows a clean line. If a nervous system could simulate threat scenarios during sleep, vivid, embodied, emotionally real scenarios in which the full experience of danger is generated without the actual body ever leaving its resting place, then the perceptual and behavioral systems involved in responding to real threats would be exercised and refined at no physical cost and no physical risk. The rehearsal would make those systems faster, more calibrated, more ready. And because the rehearsal happened in sleep, in the dark, while the body lay still and the eyes were closed, it cost nothing and risked nothing. It was pure preparation. Ravenswow was careful about what kind of rehearsal he meant. The theory did not require that dreamers practice specific motor sequences, the precise arm movement of a dodge, the exact gait of a sprint. The muscles are largely paralyzed during the kind of sleep in which vivid dreaming is most common, a fact that prevents the body from acting out what the mind is generating. What the theory proposed instead was the rehearsal of perception and evaluation, the recognition of threat, the reading of an attacker's trajectory, the scanning of an environment for exits, the emotional activation that prepares the whole organism for urgent response. These are cognitive and perceptual capacities, not muscular ones, and they can be exercised in a body that is lying completely still. The image that makes this concrete is a quiet one, a person asleep in a warm room, body unmoving, breathing slow and even, behind the stillness, in the space the sleeping mind has generated. A landscape extends, tall grass, fading light at the edge of dusk, the sound of something moving at a pace that is not calm. The dreaming mind reads the movement. It calculates. It routes the simulated body toward an opening in the brush, or finds the opening closed and routes again. No predator has entered the warm room. No actual body has run, but the system that would recognize a predator and respond to one has been very quietly at work. The size of the threat rehearsal bias, the degree to which threatening content outnumbers what waking life would predict, was quantified using a coding system developed by Calvin Hall and Robert van de Kassel in the 1960s. Their system provided standardized categories for sorting dream content, and over the decades following its publication, large cross-cultural databases accumulated. When researchers applied the Hall and Van de Kassel framework to those databases, with Ravenswow's question in mind, the results pointed in a consistent direction. Dreamers, across studied populations, reported experiencing themselves as victims of aggression more often than as perpetrators. Threatening scenarios, not just dramatic nightmare-level threats, but the full range of danger, harm, and adversity that the coding system captured, appeared at rates that a random sample of most people's ordinary waking lives simply would not produce. This is the statistical signature Ravenswow pointed to as evidence that something systematic is happening. A random process generating dream content from the ordinary texture of a day would not reliably produce this distribution. The skew toward threat has to come from somewhere, and the threat simulation theory proposes that it comes from a biological system with an ancient purpose, one that has not adjusted to the relative safety of modern environments, because 12,000 years is a very short time in the accounting of natural selection, and the nervous system that sits inside a contemporary human body was built for a world that is no longer the world outside the window. There is a version of the theory that makes the ancestral argument feel less abstract. Consider the distribution of nightmares across a human life. They are not evenly spread. Children have them at rates higher than adults. People living under conditions of chronic stress, poverty, insecurity, physical danger, the ongoing pressure of an uncertain environment have them more frequently than those living in stable safety. Ravenswow and colleagues interpreted this pattern as consistent with the proposal that the threat simulation system upregulates its activity in proportion to the perceived level of environmental danger. A child's world is genuinely less predictable and more threatening from the child's perspective. The child is small, has little control, and depends entirely on the goodwill of larger beings. A person in a dangerous environment is genuinely at elevated risk. In both cases, the sleeping mind may be running its rehearsals more often, generating more scenarios, pressing harder on the capacities it exists to train. The nightmare in this frame is not a malfunction. It is not the mind tormenting the sleeper out of some internal disorder. It is the system operating at high intensity, generating threat after threat after threat, because the information it is receiving about the environment outside suggests that high intensity is warranted. The distress is real. The elevated heart rate, the shallow breath, the residual fear that clings to the first minutes of waking, all real. But the system producing them may be doing something that in the original environment it was shaped for was exactly the right thing to do. That reframe is not comfortable in the way that easy reassurances are comfortable. It does not dissolve the experience of a nightmare. It asks instead for a different kind of understanding, one that places the unpleasant inside a longer arc, one that asks not what has gone wrong, but what the body, very old and shaped by very long pressures, understood itself to be doing. Rivon Suo drew further support for the theory from the kinds of threats that appear most frequently in dream databases. They are not random. They tend to cluster around the categories of threat that would have been most relevant in an ancestral environment: pursuit and being chased, physical assault, falling, the threat of being trapped or immobilized, the failure of escape. These are the threats that would have had the highest fitness cost in the Pleistocene, and they are the threats that dominate the nightmare landscape of populations across cultures and centuries. The content is not modern, it is old. There is a related finding from research into populations living in conditions of ongoing danger. Dream content analyses conducted with individuals in regions of active conflict or among communities facing persistent physical insecurity have found threat content calibrated differently from that recorded in populations living in relative safety. The underlying system appears to be the same. The inputs it receives about environmental danger are different. The output it produces, the frequency, the intensity, the specific character of the simulated threats adjusts accordingly. This is what a well-calibrated biological system does. It responds to its environment. It does not run the same program, regardless of the signal it is receiving from the world. The population comparisons carry a kind of quiet gravity. The same basic biological machinery, inherited from ancestors who lived in a world where the threats were immediate and physical, generating threat scenarios tuned to the specific pressures of a given environment, in a given time, among a given community of people. The system does not know that the world has changed for some of its carriers. It only knows, in whatever way a biological system can be said to know anything, what the incoming signals suggest about danger. There were questions the theory had to answer, and one of the most pressing concerned a particular population in which dreams and threat intersect in a way that is impossible to ignore. People who've experienced severe trauma, those whose threat simulations come not from ancestral imagination, but from events that actually happened, events that left a trace in the nervous system that does not easily fade, very often dream of the traumatic event itself. Post-traumatic stress disorder, as it is understood clinically, is characterized in part by intrusive symptoms that extend into sleep, nightmares that replay with painful precision the event or events at the root of the disorder. A person who survived an assault dreams of the assault. A person who endured a disaster dreams of the disaster. The dream does not soften the memory, it reinstates it with full sensory and emotional force in the middle of sleep. This posed a problem for the threat simulation theory's most straightforward version. If dreaming serves to rehearse threat responses and prepare the organism for future danger, then what is served by the endless replay of something that has already happened? The adaptive logic of forward looking rehearsal, running scenarios so that the next encounter is handled better, does not map cleanly onto a dream that returns to the same event again and again, without variation, without novel elements, without the testing of new responses. Mark Blagrove and colleagues at Swansea University looked at this question carefully through detailed analysis of dream reports from people with post traumatic stress disorder. The specific question they were trying to answer was whether the dreams characteristic of the condition were purely repetitive replays of the traumatic event, or whether they contained novel threat elements, new characters, new environments, new configurations of danger that would be consistent with the simulation process doing something more than replaying a single fixed memory. What they found was more complicated than either a clean confirmation or a clean refutation. Many of the dream reports they examined did contain novel elements alongside the repetitive core. The traumatic scenario was present, recognizable, emotionally intact, but around its edges, and sometimes at its center, were variations that had not been part of the original event. New pursuers, different settings, alternative escape routes that failed in new ways. The structure of threat was maintained, but it was not static. Blagrove and his colleagues interpreted this as evidence that the simulation process was, in at least some cases, partially functional even in the presence of severe trauma. The system was not simply reading back a recording, it was doing something with the material, generating variations, testing configurations, running the threat through different spatial and narrative arrangements. The evidence was preliminary. The population studied was limited. The methodology of analyzing self-reported dream content introduces its own complications, because memory for dreams fades quickly, and the act of describing a dream in words inevitably shapes and simplifies what is recalled. But the findings suggested that the boundary between adaptive threat simulation and pathological replay was not as clean as the simplest version of either account would suggest. This matters for how the threat simulation theory sits inside the broader scientific conversation about what dreaming is for. If post-traumatic nightmares were purely mechanical replay, a stuck record, a traumatic memory looping without modulation, that would be difficult to reconcile with the proposal that dreaming is a functional biological system. If they contain genuine variation and novel elements, even in their most extreme form, that points toward a system still attempting to do its work, still generating new scenarios from traumatic material, perhaps overwhelmed by the intensity of the input it received, but not entirely broken. The distinction is not merely theoretical, it bears on how the suffering of a person whose sleep is invaded by nightmares is understood, whether the system producing those nightmares is fundamentally intact and working as hard as it can under impossible conditions, or whether something has broken in a way that requires it to be understood differently. The threat simulation theory does not resolve this cleanly. No theory does. What it offers is a framework in which the nightmare is not an error, not a failure of the sleeping mind to protect the sleeper from distress, but a system operating at the edge of its design, shaped for a world of intermittent danger, now receiving a signal of continuous and unrelenting threat, and responding to that signal with everything it has. Rivansuo situated his theory firmly within evolutionary biology, and that situating was deliberate. The claim was not merely that dreaming tends to produce threatening content. The claim was that dreaming was shaped by natural selection to produce threatening content, that the bias toward threat in dream experience is not incidental, but is the point, the function, the reason the system exists in the form it does. This is a strong claim, and it requires strong evidence, and the evidence available to the theory is, like most evidence in the science of dreaming, indirect. The dreams themselves cannot be observed from the outside. They can only be reported after the fact by the dreamer who experienced them, and that reporting process introduces layers of distortion that every researcher in the field has to account for. Dreams are fragile in memory. The report of a dream is a reconstruction, assembled in the first minutes of waking from rapidly fading material, and the reconstruction is shaped by waking knowledge, waking language, and the waking mind's tendency to impose narrative coherence on fragmentary experience. What the dreamer reports is not the dream, it is the dreamer's best account of the dream, already several steps removed from whatever the sleeping brain actually generated. The Hall and Van de Castle system, powerful and widely used as it is, relies entirely on this kind of retrospective report. The coding categories are applied not to the dream, but to the verbal description of the dream. And verbal descriptions of dreams are known to be incomplete, shaped by memory's selectivity and influenced by what the dreamer expects a dream to contain. Threatening events may be more vividly recalled than neutral ones because they carry stronger emotional charge, and their overrepresentation in dream databases might therefore reflect memory bias rather than production bias. The sleeping brain might be generating threatening and non-threatening content in roughly equal measure, but the threatening content might simply be what wakes the dreamer, what lodges in memory, what makes it into the report. Ravensua was aware of this objection and addressed it, arguing that the magnitude of the threat bias was too large to be fully explained by differential recall, but the objection has not been definitively closed. It remains one of the methodological challenges that the field as a whole faces, not just the threat simulation theory, a challenge built into the study of a phenomenon that can only be observed through the flawed and perishable medium of the waking mind's account of what the sleeping mind produced. These are the kinds of complications that accumulate around a theory that is asking large questions with limited tools, and yet the tools have revealed enough to make the questions compelling. The consistency of the threat bias across independent studies and diverse populations is real. The developmental and environmental modulation of nightmare frequency is real. The partial evidence of novel variation in post-traumatic dream content is real. None of it proves the threat simulation theory in the way that a controlled physical experiment proves a physical law. But the pattern of evidence is not random, and the theory that makes sense of it, the theory that says the sleeping brain was shaped over very long time to lean toward danger, because leaning toward danger, in the world where the shaping happened, was what kept the organism alive, has a coherence that the numbers alone do not manufacture. There is something else the theory implies, something that sits at the edge of what the evidence can directly address, but that the theory's logic makes available. If dreaming serves a threat rehearsal function, then the content of any given person's dream life should in some way reflect that person's perceived threat landscape, not their objective circumstances. A person in genuine physical safety might dream of threats if they have reason to feel psychologically unsafe, because the system responds to the signals it receives about danger, not to an external audit of actual risk. The signal it reads is internal, generated by the whole nervous system's ongoing assessment of how dangerous the world is. This means the dream is, in a sense, a window. Imperfect, distorted by the difficulties of recall and report, but still a window into what a body understands about its own situation. A body that has lived through violence carries that understanding into sleep. A body that lives with chronic stress, with persistent uncertainty, with the low-grade but continuous signal of an environment that does not feel fully safe, carries that understanding into sleep as well. And the sleeping mind, taking that signal, generates the only response the threat simulation theory says it knows how to generate: more scenarios, more rehearsal, more practice for dangers that in the waking world the body currently inhabits may or may not ever arrive. That is the point where the evolutionary logic of the theory meets the texture of actual lived experience, and where the distance between an ancestral savanna and a contemporary bedroom closes somewhat. The nervous system inside a modern body is ancient. It does not fully distinguish between a predator in tall grass and a threatening relationship, between a rival group closing from the north and a hostile social environment at work. It reads signals of threat. It responds to signals of threat. And in sleep, away from the demands of waking action, with the body still and the external world temporarily shut out, it runs its rehearsals in the dark. The long grass at dusk, the narrowing of focus, the calculation of a route that might still be open. These are not merely images from an ancient past. They are the vocabulary that a very old system uses to process something it is still trying, in its way, to prepare for, even when the danger it is processing is not the kind that runs on four legs through tall grass. Even when the threat landscape the sleeper carries is made of something quieter and more modern and harder to outrun. Ravenswoe proposed his theory at the turn of a century, and in the years since, it has accumulated both support and challenge in roughly equal measure. The evidence for a systematic threat bias in dream content has held. The evolutionary logic has been debated, extended, and in some cases reframed by researchers who find parts of it compelling but want to push the boundaries of what counts as threat and what counts as rehearsal. The post-traumatic dream data, the nightmare frequency data, the cross-cultural content data, all of these continue to be examined, refined, and argued over in the careful, slow way that evidence accumulates when the phenomenon being studied is as difficult to observe as the interior of a sleeping mind. What the theory has given the science of dreaming is something valuable, regardless of how its specific claims ultimately fare. It has given it a way to ask about dream content, not as random noise or symbolic disguise, but as a signal with a possible function, a signal that can be measured, compared across populations, analyzed for its patterns, and interrogated for what it might reveal about the biological machinery that produces it. The question it places at the center of the inquiry is a quiet but demanding one. If this is what the sleeping mind reliably produces, what is that production for? The answer the threat simulation theory offers is ancient and specific and grounded in the long history of a body trying to survive. Whether it is the whole answer or only part of one is a question that the evidence has not yet finished addressing. The PTSD dream in Blagrove's analysis, that particular record, with its familiar threatening core and its unexpected novel variations, sits at the intersection of all the theory's tensions. It is a dream of something real, something that happened, something the nervous system has not been able to fully absorb and set aside. And yet it is not only a replay. Around the edges of the known, the simulating mind has added something new, a new exit that fails, a different face at the door, a landscape that shifts partway through into something the original event did not contain. The system, under the weight of everything it received, is still doing what it does, still generating, still varying, still in whatever ancient and imperfect way it can manage, preparing for the next encounter with something dangerous. Whether that is adaptation or suffering or both at once, whether the variation is evidence of a functional system working through impossible material, or only the mind's restless inability to hold a single fixed form, even in its most distressed states, is a question that the data describes but does not resolve. The dream record sits there, dense with threat and threaded with novelty, and the sleeping mind that produced it is already deep in the next one, rehearsing again, in the dark and the quiet, for a world it may or may not find waiting when the light comes back. Deep inside the skull, in a curved and folded structure no larger than a closed fist, a small population of neurons has been quietly keeping records all day. Every room entered, every face recognized, every turn taken down an unfamiliar street. The hippocampus does not store memories the way a drawer stores paper, flat, still, finished. It holds them the way water holds warmth, distributed through the whole, released slowly, changed by the holding. Now the room is dark. The body has been still for more than an hour, and the hippocampus has begun to do something that no waking task requires and no waking state permits. It has begun to play back the day. Not in the sequential order things happened, not with the clarity of a recording, but in compressed, rapid, privately coded bursts of electrical activity, the same neurons that fired when the feet walked a particular route, firing again, now in the same sequence, in a fraction of the original time, while the rest of the world goes on without them. The journey is replayed in miniature, the spatial memory of a path, the neural signature of a learned skill, the fragile new connection formed between two ideas that had never met before, all of it cycling and recircling in the dark interior of a resting skull, growing more stable with each pass, settling into the deeper architecture of what will be remembered for years. This is not sleep as vacancy. This is sleep as construction. The hippocampus sits close to the inner surface of the temporal lobe, curved like a seahorse, ancient in its design, a structure that appears in nearly identical form across all mammals, suggesting that whatever it does, it has been doing it for a very long time. During the hours of waking, it acts as a rapid learning buffer, capturing the high-resolution detail of new experiences before they can be properly organized into the slower, more permanent fabric of the neocortex that surrounds it. The neocortex learns gradually. It takes days, weeks, sometimes years, to fully integrate what the hippocampus can record in a moment. And so the hippocampus holds the new material temporarily while the slower system catches up. Sleep is when the catching up happens. During REM sleep, that lighter, stranger, more electrically alive phase that arrives roughly every hour and a half through the night, the hippocampus and the neocortex enter into a kind of sustained, reciprocal conversation. Sharp electrical pulses called sharp wave ripples propagate outward from the hippocampus in dense rhythmic bursts. The neocortex listens, and the pattern of listening shifts the connections between cortical neurons, some strengthened, some left to fade, so that by morning, what was fragile has become firm, and what was isolated has become linked to everything it resembles. This is the hippocampal neocortical dialogue, and it runs most richly while the body sleeps. The evidence for it comes from recordings made inside the brains of sleeping animals, electrodes positioned to capture the activity of individual neurons in the hippocampus of a rat that has spent its waking hours navigating a maze. During the run, specific neurons fire in a specific order, each one corresponding to a specific location in the space. Then the rat sleeps, and the same neurons fire again in the same order, compressed into a fraction of the time. The maze is gone. The room is dark. Nothing outside the skull resembles what is being replayed, but inside it, the journey is happening again, silent, internal, precise, while the animal lies still and breathing. It is one of the most direct demonstrations that the brain is not passive in sleep. The brain is working, and the work it is doing is the work of memory. A question follows naturally from that demonstration, though it took decades to arrive at cleanly. If sleep replays memory, can the replay be directed? Can something introduced from outside the sleeping brain steer the consolidation process, favoring one memory above others? The answer, when researchers eventually tested it, was yes. The method was subtle. Subjects were asked to learn a spatial task while a particular odor drifted through the room, something mild and identifiable, a scent associated with no prior strong memory, used purely as a marker. Later, when the subject slept, the same odor was introduced quietly into the air around them. Not enough to wake them, just enough to reach the olfactory system, while deep sleep held the rest of the brain in its slower rhythms. The sleeping subjects whose memory of the spatial task was later tested showed a marked improvement compared to those who slept without the odor's return. The odor had acted as a cue. It had found the memory formed in its presence and reactivated it during the consolidating window of sleep, giving that particular trace more time and more electrical attention than the memories that were allowed to consolidate undirected. This technique, called targeted memory reactivation, showed that memory replay during sleep is not random, not simply a mass rerunning of the day's events with no selectivity. It is a process that responds to signals. It can be biased. The sleeping brain, presented with a sensory cue connected to a specific piece of learning, allocates consolidating attention toward that piece. The cue does not produce awareness. The sleeping person does not hear it, does not know it has arrived, does not experience any particular dream in response to it, but the hippocampal replay shifts, and the morning's memory bears the mark of that shift. Researchers working across multiple independent laboratories have refined this method over many years, using sounds, odors, and even gentle tactile stimulation to trigger selective memory reactivation during sleep. The finding has held. The sleeping brain, it turns out, is not fixed in what it chooses to consolidate. It can be reached. The consolidating process, which looks from the outside like simple unconscious rest, is responsive to the world in ways that have practical consequences for what a person will be able to recall the next day, the next week, years later. The sleeping brain cares in its way about what it keeps. Not all of the consolidation happens during REM sleep. The night is longer and more layered than that. In the earlier part of the night, before REM sleep dominates, the brain moves through extended periods of deep, slow-wave sleep, a state in which the EEG trace shows large, rolling oscillations, slow as tidal breathing, sweeping across the cortex in synchronized waves. This slow-wave state is where the hippocampus does much of its most intensive replay work, broadcasting sharp wave ripples that arrive at the neocortex in the troughs of those slow oscillations, precisely timed so that the cortex is in its most receptive state for receiving and encoding the transmitted pattern. And woven through this slow-wave architecture, recurring dozens of times each night, are briefer events, small electrical storms that bloom and subside inside the thalamocortical circuit in under a second. They oscillate between 12 and 15 cycles per second, faster than the slow waves around them, but far slower than waking consciousness. Under an electrode on the scalp, they appear as brief spindle-shaped bursts, widening then narrowing again, each one marking a moment in which the thalamus and cortex are exchanging and reinforcing neural patterns. They are called sleep spindles, and they matter for memory in a way that took a long time to see clearly. The connection between spindles and memory performance emerged gradually from studies that measured both, counting the density of spindles across a night of sleep, then testing memory performance on material learned the previous evening. The relationship was consistent. People who generated more spindles per hour of sleep showed larger memory gains overnight. The correlation held across different types of material, different ages, different laboratory settings. It was not large enough to be dramatic, but it was stable enough to mean something. What spindles do at the cellular level is still being worked out. The leading picture is that each spindle creates a brief window of coordinated depolarization in cortical neurons, a moment in which those neurons are primed to receive and strengthen incoming signals from the hippocampus. The sharp wave ripple arrives. The cortical neurons, already in the favorable state the spindle produced, accept the pattern more readily. The synapse between them is adjusted. The memory carried in that pattern grows more stable. Over a full night, this happens hundreds of times. The process is quiet and distributed and slow. Nothing about it feels like learning. Nothing about it feels like anything at all, from the inside. But the person who wakes in the morning carries a slightly different configuration of neural connections than the one who went to bed, and that difference is the record of what the sleeping brain decided, in its unreflective way, was worth keeping. Sleep spindle density varies between people, and the variation appears to be partly heritable, a trait with a biological basis, not simply a function of how deeply or consistently someone sleeps. Among healthy adults, those who generate denser spindle activity consistently outperform those who generate less on tests of declarative memory, the kind of memory that holds facts, events, the contents of explicit learning. The advantage is not enormous in any single night, but accumulated across a lifetime of nights, the difference in what is retained and what is allowed to fade is vast. Memory, then, is not simply made during waking hours. It is made again during sleep, remade, stabilized, woven into the larger structure of what is already known, and the quality of that remaking depends in part on the fine electrical texture of the hours between midnight and dawn. There is something else the sleeping brain does with memory that is harder to measure and more difficult to describe, but no less real for that. The experience of waking from sleep sometimes carries in its first quiet moments a sense that something previously confusing has resolved, that a problem sat one way the night before, fixed and intractable, and arrives in the morning from a slightly different angle, as though the mind found a path around it while the body rested. This is not simply the effect of time or rest. Something more specific happens during sleep that changes the structure of what is known. Researchers at the University of California studied this directly by teaching subjects an extended sequence of mathematical problems. Each problem followed an underlying rule, and each rule had a shortcut, a hidden structure that made the whole sequence resolvable in far fewer steps if a solver could perceive the pattern. Subjects were taught the problems without being shown the shortcut. They practiced until they were competent at solving them the slow, explicit way. Then some subjects slept. Others stayed awake for the same interval. When all subjects returned to the task, those who had slept discovered the hidden shortcut at a rate roughly twice as high as those who had remained awake. The shortcut was not explained to them. No one pointed it out. The sleeping subjects simply found it, their performance revealing a structural understanding that had not been there the night before. Sleep had not just stabilized the explicit memory of the task, it had done something more, extracted a layer of abstract structure that the explicit learning alone did not make available. The brain, replaying and recirculating the learned material through the night, had found a pattern that the waking mind had not perceived, and had delivered it forward into the next day's thinking as if it had always been known. This is the process sometimes called memory distillation, the extraction, during sleep, of the deeper grammar underlying a surface experience. The sleeper does not choose it. The sleeper is not aware of it. But the result arrives in the morning nonetheless, and it feels from the inside less like learning than like remembering something that was always there, waiting to be noticed. The mechanism behind this extraction is not entirely settled. The best current picture involves the loosening of tight, context-specific memory traces during REM sleep, when the hippocampus replays in a chemical environment that differs from waking, with norepinephrine largely absent and acetylcholine relatively dominant. The replay does not simply reproduce the original experience with high fidelity. It recombines. It draws on associated memories stored elsewhere in the neocortex. It connects the new pattern to older patterns that share some structural feature, even if the surface resemblance is invisible. The result is integration, new knowledge linked not just to the specific moment of learning, but to the broader web of what is already understood. When the abstract rule finally surfaces, it does so because the sleeping brain has been holding the learned material in proximity to everything it resembles, long enough for the connections to form. This capacity for sleep to enhance not just the retention of what was learned, but the extraction of what was implicit in it, has consequences that extend well beyond the laboratory. The musician who sleeps after a difficult practice session does not merely retain the notes more reliably. The motor sequence has been refined, the timing has been smoothed. Aspects of the performance that were effortful become overnight less so, not because they were practiced further, but because the sleeping motor system replayed them and adjusted them in ways that waking practice alone does not produce. The language learner who sleeps after studying new vocabulary does not just hold the words more firmly. The grammatical patterns embedded in the examples find their way during sleep toward the abstract rules they instantiate, and the rules become accessible the next day in ways they were not the night before. Sleep, for memory, is not the end of the day. It is part of the learning itself. Among the most striking demonstrations of what sleep does to memory is what it does to memory for emotional events. Emotional experiences are not remembered neutrally. They carry, at the time of encoding, an intensity, an affective charge, elevated heart rate, the particular quality of attention that comes with something that matters, and that charge influences how the memory is stored and how it is later retrieved. Emotional events are generally better remembered than neutral ones. They are encoded more deeply. They have more hooks in the surrounding neural architecture, more connections to other stored experience, more pathways by which retrieval can reach them. But the emotional intensity of a memory is not fixed. It changes over time. And sleep, it appears, is a primary site of that change. Matthew Walker and his colleagues at the University of California designed a study to examine this directly. Subjects were shown a set of emotionally evocative images, their reactions measured at the time of viewing. Some subjects then slept. Others remained awake for the equivalent interval. When all subjects returned to view the same images and were asked to rate their emotional response, those who had slept showed a measurable reduction in distress. The images were remembered with comparable accuracy, but the emotional weight attached to them had diminished. Subjects who had remained awake showed no comparable reduction. The factual memory was intact in both groups. But the emotional texture of the memory had changed only in those who had slept. The neurochemical conditions of REM sleep appear to be what enables this. During REM sleep, the locus coeruleus, a small cluster of neurons in the brainstem that releases norepinephrine broadly across the brain during waking hours, falls nearly silent. The norepinephrine that during waking modulates the stress response, sharpens threat detection, and keeps arousal elevated is largely absent from the sleeping brain as it dreams. The amygdala, which processes emotional significance and is among the most active structures during REM sleep, replays the emotional content of remembered experiences in this chemically quieter environment without the stress hormone that accompanied the original encoding. The idea is that the emotional memory can be revisited and reprocessed in this low norepinephrine state, the factual content preserved, the distress response dampened. The memory of what happened is retained. The feeling of being in it again, of the immediate threat it carried, is gradually reduced. Sleep does not erase difficult experiences, but it changes the relationship to them, moving them from something raw and immediate into something more like a known thing, recognized but no longer fully relived. This framework has been called, simply, sleep to forget, sleep to remember, a way of naming the double action of the sleeping brain on emotional memory. What is remembered is the episode. What is partially forgotten, or at least softened, is the effective charge that made it hard to hold. The implications reach toward clinical experience. Disruption of REM sleep, whether by early waking, by certain pharmacological agents, or by the fragmented sleep that follows traumatic experience, may impair this nightly emotional recalibration. An experience that would, under normal sleep conditions, gradually lose some of its raw intensity, remains instead at full charge, encountered again in the same state in which it was first stored, without the processing that would slowly change its register. This is one of the more sobering things the research suggests, that the ordinary act of sleeping, repeated each night, does quiet emotional work that goes largely unnoticed, precisely because it succeeds. It is only when sleep is disrupted and the emotional recalibration fails that the absence of this nightly labor becomes visible. A faint smell introduced into a sleep laboratory can preferentially strengthen one memory above others without the sleeper ever knowing. A burst of electrical activity lasting less than 1 second, recurring through the night dozens of times, adjusts the threshold between a memory that holds and one that fades. The hippocampus replays the day's neural patterns in compressed bursts that arrive at the cortex precisely when the cortex is most ready to receive them, and the brain, in the low norepinephrine quiet of REM sleep, slowly separates the record of what happened from the distress of having been inside it. None of this is visible. None of it is felt. The sleeping person is simply asleep, but the evidence that these processes are real and consequential is now broad and consistent, gathered across independent laboratories, across different species, across different methods of measurement. The brain does not rest in sleep. It runs a different program, one oriented not toward engaging the world, but toward reconfiguring the record of what the world has offered, so that what will be brought to tomorrow is better organized, more integrated, and a little less sharp at its emotional edges than what was brought to bed tonight. There is something almost architectural in this. The waking day is collection, sensory input, new patterns, the raw material of experience arriving in whatever order the world presents it. Sleep is integration, the private, unrequested process by which collected things find their proper relation to one another, become part of a larger structure, and thereby become genuinely known rather than merely recently encountered. The implications for learning have been studied directly, and they are substantial. A night of sleep between a first exposure to new material and a second study session produces better retention than the equivalent amount of waking time between the two sessions. This has been shown for declarative facts, for procedural motor skills, for language learning, for mathematical reasoning. The advantage of sleep is not simply the rest. Subjects kept awake, but required to rest quietly, do not show the same benefit. The benefit arises from the active neural processes that run specifically during sleep. Among those processes, targeted reactivation appears to operate with a kind of specificity that still surprises researchers who study it. In one set of experiments, subjects learned two spatial tasks simultaneously, each paired with a distinct auditory cue. During subsequent sleep, only one of the cues was replayed. In the morning, memory for the task paired with the replayed cue was significantly stronger than memory for the task whose cue was withheld. The brain had been steered. One memory had been selectively favored over another, simply by the quiet introduction of a sound. The sleeping person had no knowledge of this. The asymmetry in their next morning's performance was the only evidence that anything had been directed. This selectivity raises a question that the research has not yet fully answered. What determines, under natural conditions, which memories get the most consolidating attention during sleep? The hippocampal replay that occurs without any external cueing is not random. Certain memories are replayed more than others, and those tend to be the ones that are novel, emotionally significant, or incomplete. The brain appears to prioritize in sleep the material that is most in need of integration, new things, things that were only partially understood, things that carried emotional weight. This is the picture that emerges from decades of careful work. The sleeping brain as an active selective archivist, sorting and integrating experience by criteria that are not consciously set, but that nonetheless produce a record better organized than the one that existed at the end of the day. And at the center of this picture, slower, quieter, more persistent than any single experimental finding, is the plain fact that every human alive does this every night. The hippocampus replays its patterns in the dark. The slow oscillations sweep across the cortex. The spindles bloom and subside in rapid succession. The amygdala processes the day's emotional residue in a brain quieter than it ever is while awake. The body is asleep. The record of the day is being remade. What emerges from that remaking, the thing laid down in the neocortex, integrated into the existing architecture of what is known, is more than a copy of the day's events. It is the day's events as they relate to everything already known, linked and organized and partially freed from the specific context in which they were first encountered. The memory of a face is connected to other faces. The memory of a route is mapped against the larger geography of what the mind already holds. The hidden rule extracted from a practice sequence is placed alongside the other rules that share its form. This is how the sleeping brain builds understanding rather than merely accumulating information, by finding in the dark and quiet of each night the relations between things and weaving them into a fabric that will hold. The process does not announce itself. It leaves no direct trace in experience. The sleeper who passes through 6 or 8 hours of hippocampal replay and cortical integration wakes with no memory of the work, no sense that anything was accomplished, no access to the precise changes made in the night's neural architecture. The knowledge arrives already installed, seamless with what was known before. Only slightly, sometimes, a person wakes and finds that something is clearer than it was, that a question has a different shape, that an answer is somehow available that was not available the evening before. The morning light falls on a mind that has been quietly, carefully, thoroughly remade. And somewhere in the temporal lobe, in the curved and ancient structure that collects the day and releases it slowly in the dark, the hippocampus settles into its morning rhythms, waiting for the waking hours to bring it new material, knowing in no way that involves knowledge that it will have time again tonight to do the quiet work of making it last. In the winter of 1977, in a laboratory at Harvard Medical School, two researchers put their names to a paper that changed the way science would speak about dreams for the next half century. The building was cold in the way that old Boston research buildings were cold, radiators ticking, windows fogged at the edges, the particular stillness of a place where people work late and say little. What J. Allen Hobson and Robert McCarley wrote was not long by the standards of scientific papers, but its central claim was direct, and it landed with the weight of something that had been building for years before anyone wrote it down. Dream content, they proposed, does not originate in the psychological depths of the mind. It does not rise from repressed wishes or unspoken conflicts or the pressures of a buried inner life. It begins, instead, in the brainstem, in the oldest and lowest part of the brain, where neurons fire in rhythmic, largely random bursts during sleep, sending signals upward into a cortex that has no way to know the signals are not real. The forebrain receives them. The forebrain does what it always does with input. It tries to make sense of it. And in that effort to make sense of noise, a dream is made. This was not a modest claim. For decades, the dominant framework for understanding dreams had placed meaning at the center of the enterprise. A dream was thought to be something that arrived from within the person, compressed, encoded, available for interpretation if one knew the language. Hobson and McCarley did not argue against this politely. They argued that the machinery of the dream was not psychological at all, and that it was electrical and chemical, and that the appearance of meaning in a dream was the cortex doing what it could with the material it had been handed, the way a skilled improviser, given a random instruction, will produce something that sounds deliberate. The improvisation is real. The intention behind the original noise is not to understand what they were proposing. It helps to settle into the brainstem itself for a moment, that dense ancient structure sitting at the base of the skull where the brain narrows toward the spine. During waking life, the brainstem manages an enormous amount of housekeeping, heart rate, respiration, the basic cycling of arousal, and during REM sleep, a cluster of cells nestled within it, neurons in the pontine region, begin firing in bursts. The bursts are not random in the way that static is random. They have a rhythm. They have a direction. They travel upward through the brain's layered architecture in sharp electrical waves, reaching structures above them in milliseconds, arriving at the visual cortex and the limbic regions and the association areas of the neocortex like signals from a source those regions cannot identify. The cortex, receiving these signals, treats them as it treats every signal. It compares them to what it already knows. It reaches into stored memory, emotional history, perceptual patterns accumulated across a lifetime. And from this reaching, it builds a scene. The brainstem fires, the cortex assembles. This, in its plainest form, is what Hobson and McCarley called activation synthesis. The activation half of the model is the brainstem doing its work. The rhythmic, ascending bursts of electrical activity that characterize REM sleep, which they called pontogeniculo-occipital waves for the path they travel from the pons through the lateral geniculate nucleus to the occipital cortex at the back of the skull. These waves carry no content, they carry energy and the instruction to process. The synthesis half is the cortex responding, drawing on every resource it has to construct a perceptual experience, from signals that arrive without a story attached. In the synthesis phase, the visual cortex produces images because it has been activated. The motor cortex generates sensations of movement because it too has been reached. And the limbic system colors everything with emotion because emotion is what it does when it is running. None of this is purposive in the usual sense. No part of the brain is trying to communicate anything to the dreamer. The process is more like a fire that casts shadows on a wall. The shadows have shapes, but the fire did not intend them. What Hobson found persuasive about this account, and what gave it its particular explanatory power, was that it accounted for something no meaning-based theory had ever addressed cleanly: the specific texture of dream bizarreness. Dreams do not simply tell stories that depart from real life in small, psychologically interesting ways. They violate the basic logic of continuous experience. A dreamer stands in one city and finds themselves in another without having traveled. A person who is clearly a childhood friend is also, without contradiction, a stranger met only once in adulthood. A building has more floors inside than its exterior could contain. Physical laws bend or fail. Time skips. The dreamer accepts all of this without question, which is itself one of the stranger features of the experience. For Hobson, the bizarreness was not symbolic, it was structural. The ascending bursts of brainstem activation are not continuous. They arrive in clusters, separated by silences. They do not arrive evenly from a single source. They reach different cortical areas at different moments, activating one region and then another without the smooth, coordinated flow that characterizes ordinary waking perception. When the cortex tries to build a coherent narrative from these discontinuous, spatially inconsistent inputs, it cannot quite manage continuity. The scene changes because the signal changed. The character shifts because a new pattern of activation reached the memory system a fraction of a second after the last one dissolved. The dreamer is not experiencing a symbol of displacement. They are experiencing the cortex's best attempt at coherence in the face of noise. The narrative feels real because the cortex is very good at constructing the feeling of reality. But the gaps between signal clusters leave their marks, and those marks are what a dreamer calls the strangeness of a dream. There is something quieting in this account. If one lets it settle fully, the dreaming mind is not concealing anything. It is not encrypting a message for a waking self to decode. It is doing the same thing it does when awake: pattern matching, assembling, constructing experience from input, but doing it in the dark, without reliable external input, handed only the irregular electrical output of a structure that is not trying to say anything at all. The result is coherent enough to feel like a world. It is coherent enough that the dreamer believes in it completely, right up to the moment of waking. But the coherence is the cortex's accomplishment, not a hidden communication from the inner life. Hobson was not done after the initial paper. In the years that followed, he continued to develop the framework, pushing it toward a more general theory of consciousness states, rather than a theory of dreaming alone. What emerged across the 1980s and into the 1990s was a model he eventually called the AIM model, a name drawn from the three dimensions he used to map all states of conscious experience. The first dimension is activation, how much energy is flowing through the system, how active the brain is overall. The second is input source, whether the signals driving cortical activity are coming from the external world, as they do in waking, or from internal sources, as they do in sleep. The third is modulation, the neurochemical ratio between aminergic and cholinergic activity, whether the system is running on the neurotransmitters that support critical, self-aware, logically disciplined cognition, or on the different mixture that supports the vivid, unconstrained, internally generated experience of REM sleep. In the AIM framework, waking consciousness sits at one position in this three-dimensional space: high activation, external input, strong aminergic modulation. Dreamless deep sleep sits at another: low activation, no meaningful input from either direction, mixed modulation. And REM sleep, dreaming sleep, occupies a third position, distant from both: high activation, internal input, cholinergic modulation, dominant. These three states are not three switches, they are three coordinates, and the brain moves between them gradually, passing through every intermediate position as the night unfolds. The model implies, quietly but clearly, that dreaming is not a special or separate thing. It is one location in a continuous space. Move the coordinates by a small amount in any direction, and the quality of experience shifts accordingly. Psychosis, Hobson noted, occupies a position in that same space, not entirely unlike dreaming: high activation, internal input, but arriving during what should be waking life, with aminergic modulation, too low to restore the critical check that normally separates inner experience from outer fact. The AIM model, rendered as three intersecting axes, has a particular elegance: a point at one corner for waking, a point at another for dreaming, and the full volume between them populated by every transitional state the sleeping brain moves through across the night: the drowsy drift toward sleep, the hypnagogic flickers just before unconsciousness, the brief confusions of incomplete waking, the thin membrane between one sleep stage and the next. Every night, the brain traces a path through this space. Every night, every person covers roughly the same territory, in the same order, visiting the same coordinates in sequence, arriving at dreaming by the same neurochemical route. There is a kind of order in that, and a kind of democracy. Whatever the dream means or does not mean, the path to it is the same for everyone. The brainstem fires. The cortex assembles. The path is the same. The paper drew a long response. Not all of it was welcome, and not all of it was wrong. From within the research community, from clinicians and neuroscientists and theorists who had spent careers thinking about what happens in the sleeping mind, there came a sustained and serious challenge to the activation synthesis account, not to its neuroscience, which was largely sound, but to what it implied about the relationship between the brain and the dream. The deepest challenge came from a researcher working at a different angle entirely, one who brought to the question not only the methods of neuroscience, but the long, careful traditions of clinical observation. Mark Solms is a neuropsychologist, trained in both the laboratory and the clinic, who spent years studying patients who had experienced damage to specific regions of the brain. The patients he saw were not laboratory volunteers awakened at precisely timed intervals during EEG-confirmed REM sleep. They were people who had suffered strokes or tumors or injuries, damage that had altered their experience in ways that were very specific and very telling. Among the patients Solms studied, some had lost the ability to dream, not the ability to sleep. They slept. Their EEG traces showed the expected cycling of non-REM and REM. Their eyes moved under their lids in the characteristic rapid bursts of the state. Everything that should have produced a dream was happening. The brainstem was firing. The pontogeniculo-occipital waves were traveling upward, reaching the cortex, doing everything the activation synthesis model described. And there were no dreams. The patients could say with confidence, on repeated awakenings from verified REM sleep, that they had experienced nothing. The damage in these patients was not in the brainstem, it was in the forebrain, specifically in regions associated with motivation, with the reaching of the mind towards something wanted, with what neurologists call the dopaminergic mesocortical and mesolimbic systems. The structures most consistently associated with the loss of dreaming were not the pontine generators of REM sleep, but the white matter pathways running through the parieto-occipito-temporal junction, and, and in some cases the ventromesial frontal lobe, areas involved in the representation of desire and the generation of appetitive behavior. In other patients, Solms found the mirror image. These were patients in whom dreaming became, paradoxically, more frequent and more vivid after forebrain lesions, specifically after damage that reduced the inhibitory influence of the frontal lobes on the deeper motivational systems. Their dreams did not simply become brighter or more emotionally intense, they became more pressing, more driven, saturated with wanting and seeking in a way that ordinary dreaming rarely reaches. Taken together, these two patterns told Solms something that the activation synthesis model had not predicted and could not easily absorb. If dreaming were simply the cortex synthesizing brainstem noise, then the machinery of dreaming should sit in the brainstem, or at least depend on it, absolutely. But the brainstem could be functioning perfectly, producing all its REM-related electrical output on schedule, and no dream would follow if the relevant forebrain systems were offline. And if those forebrain systems were disinhibited, if the motivational architecture of the brain was freed from its usual frontal governance, dreaming became unstoppable. Solms drew a careful conclusion from this evidence. The brainstem may initiate REM sleep. It may provide the activation that makes dreaming possible. But the dream itself, the experience, the narrative, the particular quality of being in a world that feels real, is generated by the forebrain, and specifically by systems whose central function in waking life is not sensation or perception, but desire. The dreaming brain on this account is not a cortex helplessly receiving random input and doing its best with noise. It is a motivational system freed from the constraints of external reality, running on its own internal fuel, constructing experience around the contours of what it wants. This was not a small amendment to the activation synthesis account. It was a reorientation of where the center of gravity in dreaming lay, away from the bottom of the brain and toward the middle of it, away from passive reception and toward active generation, away from noise and toward something more purposive in character. Solms was drawing on a tradition much older than EEG recordings or neuroimaging, a tradition of inference from damage, from the careful observation of what fails when a particular region of the brain is destroyed, and what that failure reveals about the region's normal function. This tradition had built most of what was known about the brain before scanning technologies arrived. And in the case of dreaming, Solms believed it was saying something important that the technology alone had missed. The dissociation Solms documented, REM sleep without dreaming, dreaming without REM sleep, was not easily set aside. It had been noted in scattered case reports for years before Solms organized the evidence systematically, and it pointed toward a conclusion that neither the activation synthesis model nor its predecessors had been fully prepared for, that REM sleep and dreaming might not be the same thing at all. They might be two processes that happen to overlap, that co-occur frequently enough that science spent decades treating them as identical, but which can in fact come apart under the right conditions of brain damage, neurochemical disruption, or simply the variation that exists across different individuals and different stages of life. A neurological patient in a clinical ward somewhere in a hospital that smells of floor cleaner and corridor quiet wakes from a night of verified REM sleep and reports nothing, no images, no people, no sense of having been anywhere. The EEG on the monitor beside the bed showed everything in order: the low amplitude desynchronized waves, the eye movements, the muscle atonia, all the markers that were supposed to mean dreaming was happening. And yet the patient, with no sense of loss, no anxiety about the absence, simply says, "Nothing. I was not anywhere. There was no dream." The monitor showed the right state. The experience did not come. Between the state and the experience, there is a gap, and in that gap, the question of what is truly necessary for a dream to exist sits quietly unresolved, still open after decades of careful work on both sides of the debate. Hobson himself, as the decades passed, did not retreat from the core of what he had proposed in 1977, but he acknowledged the forebrain's role more explicitly in later revisions of the model and engaged seriously with the challenge that dissociation posed. What the argument between Hobson and Solms accomplished, perhaps more than either side intended, was to make it impossible to give a simple answer to the question of where dreams come from. The brainstem contributes something essential. The forebrain contributes something equally essential. The neurochemical state of REM sleep creates conditions that no other state creates, but none of these alone is sufficient. Remove any one of them under the right conditions, and the dream does not arrive. There is a laboratory somewhere in which two researchers look at the same dream report, the same typed transcript, the same description of characters and settings and events in the voice of a single sleeper, and reach opposite conclusions. One reads it as confabulation, the beautiful and meaningless narrative a well-designed cortex builds around disordered input, the way clouds become faces to a brain that has learned to look for faces everywhere. The other reads it as a motivated construction generated by systems that carry the weight of personal history and desire, shaped by what matters to the dreamer even in the absence of the dreamer's awareness. Both of them are looking at the same few paragraphs, and while both of them have spent careers developing the instruments with which they look, the transcript does not resolve the disagreement. The data around it narrows, but does not close the space between their readings. This is not a failure. It is the condition of a question that is genuinely difficult, one that sits at the intersection of neuroscience, psychology, and the harder problem of how physical processes give rise to subjective experience at all. The dreamer in the transcript is a physical brain, producing an electrical and chemical state that generates a report. Whether the report describes noise given shape or desire given form is a question that the report itself cannot answer. It takes more than the dream to understand the dream. It may take more than is currently available. The AIM model placed dreaming in a location in consciousness space. Activation, high. Input source, internal. Modulation, cholinergic. These coordinates are measurable, at least in principle. They tell something true about the state. But the state is not the experience. The coordinates describe where the brain is. They do not fully describe what it is like to be there. And the gap between those two descriptions, the gap between the physical measurement and the felt experience, is where most of the hardest questions about dreaming still live. A sleeping person in a dark room at 3 a.m. lies entirely still. The voluntary muscles are at rest. The breath moves slowly. From the outside, nothing is happening. From the inside, or from whatever it is that the inside is, something is. A scene is present. People move through it. The dreamer is among them and does not know they are asleep and does not know there is an outside to return to. The brainstem is firing in the darkness below the cortex. The forebrain is running, bright with its own internal signals, receiving them and building with them, doing the same work it does during the day, but without any source of input from the world beyond the skull. Whether the building is purposeful or merely inevitable, whether the materials being used are the random output of an ancient cycling system or the organized expression of something the mind needs to process, the result is the same: a world felt from inside, entire and convincing, lasting until the moment it does not. What is more difficult to hold is this: a person who has not dreamed in years, not since a stroke took a small region of white matter deep in the cerebral hemisphere, does not mourn the absence. The dreams simply did not come after that. Sleep came, morning came. The interval between them was blank and quiet, like an unlit room that no one entered. The brainstem fired through the night. The REM machinery cycled as it always had, and nothing assembled in the cortex above it. Nothing arrived. The person does not report distress at this. They report the absence, the way one reports any absence, matter-of-factly, without grief, the way one might mention that the radio in a particular room has been broken for a long time and no one has fixed it. The room is fine, it is simply quiet, and somewhere else in a different clinical record, a patient with frontal lobe damage dreams with a ferocity that frightens them, vivid, saturated, overwhelming, impossible to shake even after full waking. The motivational system runs without the dampening influence that the frontal lobes normally provide, and the dreams it produces are dense with wanting, dense with pursuit and need, pressing against the waking hours long after the night has ended. These two patients are at opposite poles of the same dissociation. Both of them are evidence. Neither of them alone is the whole picture. There is a version of the activation synthesis account that survives all of this, not unchanged, but intact at its core. The brainstem does fire during REM sleep. The signals do travel upward. The cortex does assemble experience from them. Whatever the forebrain contributes, whatever motivational architecture shapes the material into recognizable human concerns, the basic sequence is real. Activation from below, synthesis above. The confabulation is real in the sense that the cortex is genuinely doing the work of constructing coherence from inputs that do not arrive in a coherent form. The specific bizarreness of dreams, the discontinuities, the scene breaks, the merged identities, the violated geometries, is real, and the activation synthesis account offers a genuine explanation for it that no other theory matches quite as directly. For the texture of the experience, for the why of its particular strangeness, Hobson's account still carries weight. What it handles less well is the directed quality of many dreams, the way they cluster around what matters to the dreamer, the way the faces in them tend to be the faces of people who count, the way the threats in them tend to be the threats that are already present in the dreamer's waking life, scaled perhaps, transformed perhaps, but recognizably continuous with a real emotional landscape. The cortex, if it were purely synthesizing noise, would be expected to produce something more uniformly distributed, a flatter profile of content across the full range of possible perceptual and narrative combinations. What dreamers report is not flat. It tilts toward the personal, toward the emotionally significant, toward the concerns of a specific life. Whether that tilt comes from the forebrain's motivational shaping or from the cortex's use of autobiographical memory as the raw material of synthesis, or from both at once, is a question that remains not fully answered. In the deep of the night, in a brain that is neither fully asleep nor fully awake by any simple measure, in that narrow corridor between REM and the first pale approach of morning, something persists. The brainstem will cycle again before dawn. The ponto-geniculo-occipital waves will travel their upward path one more time. The cortex will receive them and will build from them what it can, whether what it builds is a theater of noise, artfully given narrative shape, or the motivated production of a mind that has things to work through. The experience of being inside it will be the same, real, present, felt as entirely true from the position of the dreamer, gone at the moment of waking like a structure that was never made of permanent material. Hobson proposed that dreams are the brain making the best story it can from a poor and random signal. Solms proposed that the signal is not so random that the forebrain has its own reasons for what it generates, and that those reasons are legible in the content if one knows where to look. Between these two positions, the question of what a dream is made of rests without a final answer. Both accounts are built on real evidence. Both accounts describe something true about the sleeping brain. Neither one alone is large enough to contain the full phenomenon. The researcher who reads a dream report as confabulation is not wrong about the brainstem. The researcher who reads it as motivated construction is not wrong about the forebrain. They are standing on different sides of the same structure, measuring the parts they can reach, and the structure is larger than either set of measurements. This is not a comfortable position for a science that prefers clean conclusions, but it is an honest one. The dream, in the end, is the product of a brain that is doing several things at once, running on neurochemistry that human understanding has mapped only partially, generating experience that cannot yet be fully captured by any account that begins from one end alone. The building stands cold in a Boston winter. The paper is published. The claim is on the record. Dreams begin in the brainstem, and somewhere in a clinical ward, a patient with an intact brainstem and a silent motivational forebrain reports, without distress, that there was nothing. The EEG showed the right state. The experience did not come. The gap between those two facts, between the state that should have been sufficient and the experience that did not arrive, is not a gap that has been closed. It remains. It is quiet. It holds with great patience the most difficult version of a question that has been asked since the first person woke and tried to describe where they had been. What was necessary for the dream, whether it was the firing or the receiving, whether it was the noise or the need, whether the brain that builds a world from random signals and the brain that builds a world from its own desire are doing something different, or something that only appears different because it is being measured from opposite ends of the same long room. The night continues. The brainstem fires in the dark below the cortex, ancient and steady and entirely without intention, the way a spring releases water into a riverbed that shapes it without having planned to. The cortex receives the signal and reaches for what it knows, the faces, the places, the textures of a life that exists only in its own memory. And from these, in the brief and private hours between midnight and morning, it makes what it makes. The dream is there, then it is not. The person who had it cannot say, in the morning, whether it came from noise or from need. Neither, for now, can anyone else. The light comes slowly into the room. The night releases its hold, as it always does, quietly, without announcement, and what was built in the dark dissolves back into the ordinary waking world, leaving only the faint residue that fades before the first full hour of day has passed. The brain, in the long, quiet hours of sleep, does not go dark. It hums, not with the bright, directed electricity of a mind attending to something, but with a slower, more diffuse kind of illumination, the kind that belongs to maintenance, to the steady upkeep of what has been built over a lifetime of days. Jijung, working in the early years of this century, proposed that this humming had a purpose older and more basic than any single theory of dreaming had yet considered. Not the rehearsal of danger, not the distillation of memory, not the synthesis of brainstem noise into narrative. Something quieter than all of those. The brain, he argued, keeps its memory circuits lit simply because they cannot be allowed to go dark. An archive that loses its light loses what it holds. And so the dreaming mind tends its own shelves, moving through them in the long hours before morning, not adding or revising, but keeping the whole structure warm and present and intact. Picture the archive itself. It has no walls that could be measured, no corridors that could be walked, but it has something like a quality of light, a faint, continuous activation spread across the regions where a life's worth of knowing has been laid down. Language is stored somewhere in that archive. So is the face of a person loved for decades, and the feel of a particular staircase underfoot, and the grammar of how one social situation tends to unfold into another. All of it requires the regular passage of a signal to remain retrievable. Without that signal, without the brain's ongoing maintenance current, something in the stored record begins to soften at its edges, to lose the precision that makes it usable when the waking world needs it again. Jean called this the continual activation function, not a dramatic term, not one that announces itself. It describes something more like the work of a groundskeeper than an architect, the slow, unhurried tending of what already exists, done in the hours when the building stands empty and the day's business is finished. This picture of dreaming as maintenance sits alongside the more vivid theories without canceling any of them. It asks something slightly different of the sleeping brain than threat rehearsal asks, or memory consolidation, or the cortical synthesis of brainstem noise. It asks only that the circuits stay warm, that the archives stay lit, that by the time morning arrives and the waking world begins to press its demands again, nothing stored in the long record of a lived life has faded past the point of retrieval. The brain, on this account, dreams partly because it cannot afford not to, because the cost of total neural silence spread across every night of every year of a long life would be a slow and imperceptible erosion of everything a person knows. Across the long stillness of a night's sleep, while the maintenance current moves through those memory structures, something else is also happening in the dreaming mind. Other people appear. They arrive with faces, with histories, with intentions that the dreaming brain tracks and models and responds to with the same social machinery it uses during waking hours. A conversation unfolds inside a dream, a negotiation, a misunderstanding, a moment of alliance, and the brain that is dreaming, it follows the relational dynamics with a precision that would be difficult to fake. Cachiavelli, developing a line of inquiry seeded by Robin Dunbar's work on the social brain, proposed that dreaming serves in part to practice this, the dense, cognitively demanding work of living among other minds. The theory carries the name social simulation. It positions the dreaming brain not as a passive scene viewer, but as an active modeler of human relationships, rehearsing in the offline hours the skills that waking social life requires. Dunbar's own research had established something about the size and structure of human social groups, that maintaining the alliances, tracking the hierarchies, modeling the intentions and emotional states of the many individuals who make up a functioning social world, requires more cognitive capacity than almost any other task the human brain performs. The primate brain across many species grew larger in proportion to the complexity of the social groups it had to navigate, and the human brain grew largest of all in a species whose social worlds had become extraordinarily intricate, layered with history, obligation, expectation, and the constant inference of what another person knows and feels and intends. If the brain needed to rehearse any capacity during the offline hours of sleep, this one, the grammar of human connection, would have strong reason to be among them. Valley's framework extends the logic of an earlier theory without simply repeating it. Where threat simulation proposed that the dreaming brain rehearses the specific scenarios most likely to end badly, the chase, the confrontation, the sudden danger, social simulation proposes something broader, that the brain rehearses relationship itself, the management of alliance, the repair of rupture, the reading of another person's face for the information it carries about what they will do next. These are capacities that do not fire and fall dormant the way a single threat avoidance behavior might. They are continuous, contextual, endlessly variable, and dreams, it turns out, are dense with them. Josie Melanowski and her colleagues at the University of East London have worked to bring empirical weight to this framework. The method they used is the kind that does not produce results quickly. It requires participants to record their dream experiences in detail, morning after morning, building a diary of the interior life of the sleeping mind over time. Malinowski's team paired those diary records with waking measures of social and emotional functioning, tests of empathy, assessments of how well a person reads and responds to the emotional states of others. What the comparison found was a correlation between the social complexity of a person's reported dreams and their measured capacity for empathy and social functioning while awake. The dreaming brain that populated its nights with rich, varied, relationally nuanced social scenarios tended to belong to a person who, in waking life, moved through relationships with greater attunement. A correlation carefully understood does not settle the question of direction. It does not say whether dreaming rich social dreams produces greater empathy or whether a brain already well equipped for social understanding simply imports that richness into its sleeping hours. The relationship between the two may run in both directions at once, or through some third factor that shapes both. What the correlation does do is place a measurable observation on the table, a number drawn from the raw material of dream diaries and social assessments, and hold it up against the social simulation framework to ask whether the pattern fits. It does fit, not conclusively, but in the way that real evidence fits real hypotheses, imperfectly, partially, and with enough signal in the noise to warrant continued attention. The dream diaries themselves deserve a moment of consideration because the kind of document they produce is unusual. A participant sits in the early morning light, sleep still close, and writes down what the night contained. The dream is already dissolving, its images pulling apart in the warmth of waking, its emotional logic becoming harder to trace. And what ends up on the page is something between the experience and its reconstruction. Memory does its work in the interval between the dream and the writing. Emotion colors what feels worth recording. The most vivid moments persist. The textured, ordinary middle of a dream sequence often slips away. What researchers receive, then, is not a perfect readout of the sleeping mind's activity, but a record shaped by memory, language, and the particular conventions of how people understand and describe their own inner lives. The Hall and Vandecassel coding system was built to work with this kind of material, to extract something systematic and comparable from the irregular, subjective terrain of the recorded dream. Calvin Hall and Robert Vandecassel published the system in 1966, and it has been applied to dream databases across cultures and across decades since then. The system provides categories, settings, characters, social interactions, emotions, aggressive encounters, misfortunes, and a trained coder reads a dream report and tallies the relevant instances, how many characters appeared, whether social exchanges were friendly or hostile, what emotional tone the dreamer reported, whether the dreamer was a victim of aggression or an agent of it. The tally, repeated across many dreams and many dreamers, begins to reveal patterns that no single report would show. Those patterns, once revealed, can be compared. A database of dreams from one cultural context can be set beside a database from another, and the systematic similarities and differences emerge from the numbers rather than from impression. The same set of dream reports can be run through the coding system by researchers working from different theoretical frameworks, one looking for evidence of threat simulation, one looking for the footprint of social cognition, one asking about emotional processing, and each finds the categories their framework predicted would be present because the same dream is available to more than one kind of reading. This is not a weakness of the coding system, it is a fact about the richness of the material. Dreams are not simple. They carry more information than any single theoretical lens can exhaust. The limitation that lives beside this richness is the one already named. The record is retrospective. Between the experience and the recording, memory has been at work. The distortions memory introduces are not random. They follow patterns of their own, shaped by emotional salience, by narrative convention, by what a person believes about their own dream life. Someone who thinks of their dreams as often threatening may organize their dream memories around the threatening moments, trimming the quieter content away. Someone who keeps a dream diary regularly develops, over time, a practiced genre for dream description that may or may not capture the actual texture of the experience. The numbers that emerge from coding are real numbers. They are just numbers derived from something that was already once removed from the event they describe. Researchers who work in this field carry this limitation in constant awareness, and the best of them are careful about what their numbers can claim. They do not pretend the coded diary entry is the same as the dream. They treat the diary entry as evidence, real, usable evidence about what the dreaming brain produced, filtered through the instruments of memory and language, and read against the theoretical frameworks that give the numbers their meaning. It is not an ideal measurement situation, but it is the measurement situation that the nature of dreaming produces, and working carefully within its constraints has yielded more than working not at all would have. A research table exists. It exists in the published literature, in the supplementary materials of papers, and the combined outputs of many independent laboratories, that holds all of this together in a way that is worth pausing to picture. Along its rows, a set of dream reports, each one a coded record of a night's interior experience. Down its columns, the measures that different theoretical frameworks have proposed as their relevant footprints. One column counts threatening scenarios and aggression calibrated to the threat simulation prediction. Another tracks social characters and relational dynamics, tallied for the social simulation hypothesis. A third records measures associated with emotional memory processing, the presence and resolution of emotionally charged content, the valence shifts across the dream narrative. A fourth carries indices of formal strangeness, scene discontinuities, violations of physical coherence, of the kind associated with the brainstem activation argument. Each column represents a different theory looking at the same dreams. Each finds something. No single column accounts for everything the others find. The table does not resolve into a single answer, because the single answer is not yet there to be found. Robert Stickgold, working at Harvard Medical School, and Antonio Zadra at the Université de Montréal have each spent years looking at this kind of material, and both have arrived at a position that the evidence seems to support, that insisting on a single function for dreaming may be the wrong kind of insistence. The pluralist position they advocate does not say that every proposed function is equally well supported, or that the frameworks are interchangeable. It says something more specific than that. It says that REM sleep and dreaming may serve several functions simultaneously, that a single night of dreaming may accomplish threat rehearsal and emotional memory processing and the maintenance of memory circuits and the practice of social cognition, not in alternation and not in competition, but all at once in the same period of biological activity, each process drawing on different aspects of what the dreaming brain is doing and leaving different kinds of traces in the record that researchers can later read. The logic behind this position is not complicated. The brain is a system of enormous parallel complexity. In waking life, a single moment of experience engages threat assessment and social modeling and memory retrieval and emotional regulation and sensory processing simultaneously. There is no reason to expect that during sleep, the same brain would organize itself to accomplish only one function at a time, as if the biological machinery that runs many processes in parallel during waking would, for the hours of sleep, narrow itself to a single designated task. The single function frameworks each capture something real. The memory consolidation evidence is real. The threat content in dreams is real and statistically systematic. The neurochemical conditions of REM sleep are real and have genuine consequences for how emotional memories are processed. The social scenarios in dreams are real and measurably correlate with social capacity. But none of these realities requires the others to be absent. What changes from person to person, and from one stage of a single life to another, and from one environmental context to another, is the balance. A child living in a setting of persistent physical danger may carry a dream life weighted heavily toward threat simulation, the rehearsal system upregulating its activity in response to inputs from the waking environment. A person in a complex social situation may find their dreaming nights populated with social scenarios of particular intricacy and density. A period of intense new learning may shift the balance toward memory consolidation processes, the hippocampal replay strengthening the structures most recently built. These variations do not mean the other functions disappear. They mean the mix changes, the way the same instrument can play many notes, and the ones that sound loudest depend on what the moment requires. In the long dark of a sleep laboratory, in a room that is kept quiet and kept dark and held at a temperature that the sleeping body will not notice, the polysomnographic record is running. Electrodes placed gently against the scalp pick up the electrical activity of the cortex beneath, the shifting patterns of slow-wave sleep, the sudden transition into the faster, lower amplitude trace of REM, the eye movements visible in the recording as the closed lids move in their conjugate bursts. The record runs through the whole night, accumulating, and somewhere inside the sleeping person in that room, all of this is happening at once. The archive is lit and tended. The social world is being rehearsed in the theater of a populated dream. The emotional charge of a difficult memory is being quietly reduced by the chemistry of a brain that has withdrawn its norepinephrine and let the emotional association rest in gentler conditions. The hippocampus is replaying the day's experience in compressed internal silence. The brainstem is generating the signal that drives all of it forward, and the cortex is receiving that signal and doing what it does, assembling, from the pieces it has available, something that from the inside feels like a world. The sleeper does not know any of this is happening. The dreaming mind is occupied entirely with the dream, with the room it is standing in, the person it is speaking to, the sense of pursuit or discovery or melancholy that colors the scene. The theories exist outside the dream. They exist in the waking world, in the papers and debates and methodological arguments and coded dream databases that researchers have built across decades of careful work. From inside the dream, none of that is visible. From inside the dream, there is only the dream, vivid, present, strange, and entirely convincing for as long as it lasts. That conviction is itself worth noting. The dreaming mind does not experience itself as theorizing or rehearsing or consolidating or maintaining. It experiences itself as being somewhere, doing something, with other people, or alone, in a place that has the full texture of reality for the duration of the experience. The emotional responses it generates are not metaphors for emotional responses. They are the responses themselves, running in the same neural substrate that produces them during waking, producing the same physiological signatures in the sleeping body. A frightening dream does not merely represent fear, it generates fear, elevated heart rate, accelerated breathing, the subjective quality of dread, inside a body that is lying still in a dark room with no external threat present. A dream of reunion with someone long absent does not merely represent longing. It produces the feeling of longing, and sometimes its opposite, in the sleeping mind, with a completeness that makes the waking moment of return to ordinary life feel like a subtraction rather than an addition. The richness of that interior experience, the completeness of it, the sensory and emotional density that the dreaming mind generates from nothing but its own resources, is itself a kind of evidence for the importance of what is happening there. Evolution does not tend to maintain metabolically expensive processes without return. REM sleep is metabolically demanding. The brain during REM uses nearly as much energy as it does during waking. The body sacrifices skeletal muscle control, leaving the sleeping person temporarily paralyzed from the neck down, a state that would be dangerous were there not strong selection pressure for the benefits that state enables. All of this has been maintained across the full evolutionary span of the mammals. Every mammal studied sleeps. Most show evidence of REM. The infant brain, in humans and in many other species, spends a disproportionate amount of its sleep time in REM, as if the developing mind needs the offline rehearsal and maintenance and social practice more urgently than the adult mind does, or needs it in greater quantities while the architecture of cognition is still being built. The birds sleep in REM. Some reptiles show evidence of something that resembles it. The deeper the phylogenetic tree is traced, the more universally some version of this state appears. A period of active internal brain processing during sleep, coupled with the behavioral stillness and the characteristic electrical signature that marks it as something different from simple rest. That universality is itself a kind of argument, not for any single theory, for the general principle that what happens in this state matters, that the brain, across the long span of vertebrate history, has found the cost worth paying, the paralysis, the metabolic expense, the vulnerability of deep sleep, because what the state produces is more valuable than the cost of producing it. What it produces is still, in the fullest sense, not known. The honest accounting of where the science stands does not allow for a single confident answer. There are several good answers, each with real evidence behind it, each illuminating a genuine aspect of what the dreaming brain does. The threat simulation framework captures something real in the statistical pattern of threatening content in dream reports, in the elevated nightmare frequency in populations under persistent danger, in the way dream scenarios of pursuit and confrontation and attempted escape are structured like rehearsal rather than like mere noise. The memory consolidation evidence is real in the hippocampal replay recordings, in the causal demonstrations of targeted memory reactivation, in the sleep dependent extraction of abstract patterns from learned material. The activation synthesis framework captures something real in the neurochemistry of REM, the brainstem signals, the cortical confabulation, the characteristic discontinuity of dream scenes. The social simulation work captures something real in the coded density of social scenarios in dream reports and in their correlation with waking social capacity. The continual activation framework captures something real in the plain metabolic fact that the brain, during sleep, never actually stops. The frameworks are not yet unified. There is no single theoretical structure that contains all of them without loss, no master account of dreaming that absorbs the evidence each has generated and returns a coherent picture. That unification may come. It may come in the form of a new framework that has not yet been proposed, built by researchers who are now beginning their work, whose names do not yet appear in the literature, who are sitting in sleep laboratories and developing new methods of measuring what the sleeping mind does and what it produces. It may come more slowly through the gradual convergence of multiple lines of evidence toward a shared conclusion that no single researcher planned. Or it may be that dreaming resists unification, not because the science is insufficient, but because the phenomenon itself is genuinely plural, a state that accomplishes many things because the brain is a system capable of many things, and does not organize itself around a single purpose any more than waking life organizes itself around a single purpose. The room where a person sleeps is quiet. The curtains hold out whatever light the night carries, the orange spill of city glow, or the blue-white of a full moon, or the absolute dark of a place far from artificial light, where the sky is the only illumination and the stars are too faint and too far to matter to a closed room. The body in that room has given itself over to the process. Breathing slows, muscle tone releases, the small turbulences of the day's attention finally stop their turning, and the brain, released from the demands of the waking world, turns inward toward its own archives, its own models, its own generated imagery, its own chemistry, and begins the work it has been doing, in some form, across hundreds of millions of years of vertebrate history. The work does not announce itself. It does not explain its purpose or compile its own record. The dreaming mind does not know it is rehearsing anything. It does not know it is consolidating memory or tending the circuits of a long-built knowledge archive or practicing the social grammar of a complex relational world. It knows only what it is experiencing, the specific and entirely convincing texture of the dream that holds it, for as long as the dream holds. And then the dream dissolves, as they always do, not in an instant, but gradually, the scene going soft at its edges, the emotional tone persisting a little longer than the images, the whole structure thinning and losing its weight as the brain shifts into a different kind of sleep or begins the long, slow return to waking. Most of what was dreamed will not be remembered. The architecture of the night's dreaming, the full record of images and social scenarios and emotional sequences that the sleeping brain generated across its hours of active internal processing, survives in memory only in fragments, if at all. The first dream of the night, in the short REM period closest to sleep onset, is almost certainly gone before morning. The longer REM periods of the later hours, closer to waking, are more likely to leave some residue, an image, a feeling, a half-coherent narrative that holds together just long enough to be written down or to color the first minutes of the waking day before it dissolves entirely in the business of being awake. What persists is not the dream. What persists is what the dream accomplished, the slightly softened emotional charge of a difficult memory, the neural record of a social scenario practiced in the privacy of the sleeping mind, the strengthened trace of something learned that the hippocampus replayed in the dark and delivered, more firmly encoded to the cortical structures where it will be held. The dream was the process, its content was the means by which the process ran, and the content largely is gone, returned to the same interior silence from which it was generated, leaving behind only the changes it produced in the brain that held it. There is something right about that arrangement. The most important work is often the work that leaves no visible artifact, the maintenance performed, the structure held, the erosion prevented. A building whose foundation has been carefully tended looks the same as one that has not, until the moment it does not. The brain tended in sleep, its memory circuits maintained, its threatening scenarios rehearsed, its emotional memories softened, its social capacities exercised, carries its nighttime work forward into the waking day as capacity rather than as record. The dream is forgotten. What the dream built remains. In the sleep laboratory, the recording runs until morning. The polysomnographic trace accumulates its hours of data, the slow oscillations of deep sleep, the ROM periods growing longer as the night advances, the brief partial awakenings that leave no trace in the sleeper's memory, the gradual shift in the record that signals the approach of natural waking. Somewhere in that record are the electrical signatures of all the theories at once, the threat simulation activity, the memory replay, the cholinergic brainstem drive, the social scenario construction, the maintenance current keeping the archive lit. They do not separate themselves neatly into columns. They run together, overlapping and simultaneous, in the single unitary record of one brain spending one night doing what brains have spent every night doing, across species and across deep time, since sleep itself was established as the essential counterpart to waking. The researcher who will read that record in the morning has not yet arrived. The laboratory is quiet. The recording equipment hums at its own low frequency, steady and indifferent. The sleeper breathes. The eyes move beneath the lids in their small, precise conjugate bursts, while the body lies completely still. Outside the window, the night is doing what nights do, holding the dark, turning slowly on its axis, carrying the sleeping city forward through its hours toward the gradual brightening that will come, whether or not anyone is watching for it. The brain does not wait for morning to do its work. It has already been at work for hours,